What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I discussed Jefferson's vision for the United States as a more democratic republic, as well as pointing out, with an assist from Triumph the Insult Comic Dog, who this vision included in Jefferson's mind and who it very much did not include. I talked about the steps that Jefferson took to alter the federal government in ways that align more with his and with the Democratic Republican Party's vision of American society, including significantly shrinking the size of the federal workforce, the Army, the Navy, and reducing the national debt. I also discussed how Jefferson's administration did moderate somewhat by not completely overhauling the bureaucracy and by maintaining key elements of the Hamiltonian financial program, like the Bank of the United States and the tariffs. In this episode, I will discuss Jefferson's first foray into foreign policy and his embrace of executive power now that he had it, as well as the epochal Louisiana Purchase and the enormous impact that it had on the United States in both the short and the long term. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Again, if you're enjoying what I'm doing, liking, subscribing, spreading the word to other people, best possible thing that you can do to help out the channel and ensure that I get to keep doing this. So, if you're really enjoying it, please subscribe, please pass the word along. It really does help. Thanks very much. I appreciate all your time and attention and all the wonderful comments I've gotten back from everybody who's watched. I will, as I usually do, go through the resources that I used to put this episode together and give you a question to think about as I go through the information. So starting with the resources, they're about the same as usual. It is The American Pageant, which is a commonly used AP US history textbook, as well as Give Me Liberty, another commonly used AP US history textbook. There is, of course, The Art of Power, the John Meacham biography of Thomas Jefferson. There's also John Adams, the biography of John Adams by David McCullough. And there is Empire of Liberty, the Oxford History of the United States series book that covers this period, 1789 to 1815, and is named for a phrase that Jefferson came up with to describe what he saw as the future of the United States, that it would be an Empire of Liberty. So those are the resources that I'm using. Here's the question that I think it'd be good for you to think about as I'm going through this stuff. How did the Louisiana Purchase and the First Barbary War illustrate both Thomas Jefferson's foreign and domestic policy agendas, and how did the outcomes of each contribute to the expansion of American influence in the world? I'll say that one more time. How did the Louisiana Purchase and the First Barbary War illustrate both Thomas Jefferson's foreign and domestic policy agendas, and how did the outcomes of each contribute to the expansion of American influence in the world? So think about that as I'm going through this stuff, and I think it'll help you to gain a greater understanding of the information that I am discussing. Okay, without further ado, let's get to it, shall we? So as I mentioned in the last episode, Jefferson made it a priority to defang the military when he took over as president. The country went from building up for a fight with one of the great powers of Europe, France, with the quasi-war, to disbanding the army almost completely and reducing the naval personnel and even mothballing some of the ships constructed during the Adams administration. Mothballing meaning they just kind of put them aside and they didn't really get completed as naval projects. Or if they were completed, they just kind of sat there. However, Jefferson very quickly found a reason to employ the Navy, the Barbary Pirates. And I think the Barbary Pirates are not necessarily what we generally in the West think of as pirates. I'm sure if you're of my generation or younger, you're probably thinking Pirates of the Caribbean first when you hear it, all that kind of shit. But these pirates were not from the Caribbean, from the Western Hemisphere even. These pirates were in the Old World. In this case, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco in North Africa collectively made up what were known as the Barbary states. All of them, except for Morocco, were regencies. Basically, they were internally autonomous. They got to kind of dictate their own policies that went on in their borders, but they did not have self-control of foreign relations as regencies because they were regencies of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been around since like the 13th century and dominated much of the Middle East, pieces of Eastern Europe, what we would now call the Balkans, and North Africa, although it didn't really rule over North Africa all that closely. Since roughly the mid-16th century or the mid-1500s, the Barbary corsairs, or pirates, regularly attacked European seafaring vessels in the Mediterranean Sea and in the Atlantic Ocean, seeking to capture booty and or take captives for ransom or to sell as slaves. They also engage in raids on various parts of the Mediterranean world to capture slaves and or treasure. There are a lot of accounts, for example, of the Barbary pirates attacking like Greek islands and taking whatever they could and then bailing out before anybody could stop them. European states had mostly paid a form of tribute to these states in North Africa, the Barbary states, so that their privateers, which is another way of describing kind of pirates that are associated with a particular country. I talked about privateers when I talked about the Revolutionary War, for instance, because privateers are pretty much all the government under the Articles of Confederation could afford to have. We did not, in the United States during the Revolutionary War, have a formal navy. It was too damn expensive. Eventually, we leaned on France to help us out there. But in the case of the Revolutionary War, what we did have were privateers, people that acted as a sort of informal navy and also kind of pirates to raid British ships, whether they were commercial ships or warships, more likely commercial ships, because American privateers are not going to try to fuck with British warships. That's too dangerous. But in the case of the Barbary pirates, the corsairs, they were privateers for these Barbary states. They operated under the approval of the Barbary state governments, such as they were, and they kind of did the bidding in some cases of these states, and in other cases just sort of took whatever they could. If it seemed like a good heist, they would get in on it and take what they could and make a living that way. Otherwise, they'd follow some, maybe kind of loose instructions from the governments of these Barbary states to go after Italian vessels or French vessels or whatever it was that their government might suggest to them. If you can have government-employed pirates, that's sort of what we're talking about here. European states did pay tribute to these Barbary state governments to try to get their ships left alone. The British and the French, for example, would pay X amount of doubloons or pounds or francs or whatever currency it was that the Barbary pirates would accept. I would imagine mostly it was specie, it was hard gold or silver currency to these governments to try to get the Barbary pirates to leave their shipping alone. As British colonies, the United States had benefited from this payment system of protection money to the Barbary states because the Barbary states treated American colonial vessels like they were British vessels, because basically they were, and didn't really mess with them. During the Revolutionary War, American vessels were operating more or less under the protection of France, according to the alliance that we made with France in 1778. So the Barbary states didn't really mess with us during the Revolutionary War either, in the same way that they didn't really mess with us when we were a colony of Great Britain. Upon independence, however, the United States was no longer under the protection of either Great Britain or France, and we found ourselves in the United States a victim of the Barbary corsairs starting in about 1784, which you recall that the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War in 1783. Foreign ministers John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were both in Europe at the time, John Adams was in Britain, Thomas Jefferson was in France, they attempted to work out a similar kind of payoff system to the Barbary pirates, but even after payments, the states did not stop capturing American ships, stealing their cargo and taking sailors captive, often making these poor sailors who they took captive slaves. The weakness of the government under the Articles of Confederation prevented the United States from taking any sort of military action against the pirates, as some, including Jefferson, favored. He thought the payments were not going to work in the long run. As a guy who talked about peace among nations and who didn't like warfare, he was interestingly aggressive when it came to the Barbary States. Go figure. But when the new Constitution went into effect, some in Congress and in the Washington administration considered naval intervention against the Barbary States. Congress voted to take action on two fronts, finally, in 1794, by voting $1 million to purchase a peace and ransom American prisoners, and another $1 million to build 6 frigates to potentially use force against the Barbary Pirates. Frigates are a kind of warship, just to be clear. Now, the treaties that we bought, we did get to free some of our captive sailors. But in terms of purchasing a leave us the fuck alone license from the Barbary Pirates, that didn't exactly work out. All it did do, seemingly, was encourage the Barbary Pirates to attack us more, to exact more tribute. So it was a pretty frustrating situation for both the Washington and Adams administrations in the 1790s. When Jefferson took office, he insisted on abandoning the payments, so he kind of resumed his aggressive stance when he was minister to France, especially after Tripoli effectively declared war on the United States by cutting down the flagstaff in front of the U.S. consulate. That's how the state of Tripoli declared war, not by any formal written declaration or announcement or anything. They just cut down this flagstaff that was in front of the U.S. consulate in Tripoli. This was after additional tributes and ransoms to Algiers had proved ineffective at solving the problem of piracy against American shipping. Jefferson sent a squadron to the Mediterranean with instructions to attempt peace once more with Tripoli, but to defend American shipping by force if the overtures for peace failed. There were no negotiations, however, and though Jefferson felt constrained by the Constitution from taking offensive action because, according to the Constitution, only Congress can actually declare war, and Jefferson wanted to respect that as a strict constructionist, American forces, before any declaration of war and after negotiations didn't really come to fruition, combined with a Swedish flotilla to blockade Tripoli. That is, to try to stop ships from coming in and out of Tripolitan ports, which, by the way, in modern terms, is considered an act of war. Blockading is pretty aggressive and does enough damage that it's considered an act of war. Congress never declared war against Tripoli, but it did authorize Jefferson to instruct all American naval ships to seize all goods and ships of Tripoli and behave in whatever way was necessary to safeguard American ships. So in that regard, it's a little bit like the authorization of force that Congress granted to President George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And under that authorization of force that Congress gave to President Bush, the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq were prosecuted by the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, into the Biden administration, at least in Afghanistan. The first actual fighting between American naval ships and Barbary pirates or corsairs took place in August of 1801, when the USS Enterprise defeated a Tripolitan corsair ship called Tripoli. Pretty on-the-nose name. In 1802, Congress authorized even greater authority for Jefferson to act against the Barbary Pirates, and by the end of the war in 1805, at least 16 naval vessels had been sent to the area, to the Mediterranean or western part of Europe, Africa, and the Atlantic Ocean, to seize and harass Barbary corsairs and to blockade their ports. Probably the most famous incident of the war involved the USS Philadelphia, which ran aground, that is to say, got in water that was a little too shallow and got stuck. Couldn't move, and it was captured by Tripolitans. On February 16th of 1804, after the ship had been in the possession of the Tripolitans for a few months, Stephen Decatur led a crew piloting a captured corsair ship into the harbor where the Philadelphia was held, and this corsair ship was disguised. So it was Americans piloting it, but it didn't look that way. And they piloted this captured ship into the Tripolitan harbor so that the men could destroy the USS Philadelphia to prevent the Tripolitan government, the Barbary Pirates, from using it against the United States or anybody else. They succeeded without a single death under very difficult circumstances, and I read in a couple of places that Admiral Horatio Nelson, the big naval hero of Great Britain, called it one of the most daring or one of the most bold missions that was launched during the period. And, pretty high praise coming from a guy like that who won these big battles against the French at the Battle of the Nile and Trafalgar. And though this raid is very famous, it's not what actually brought the war to a conclusion. The Battle of Derna was what gave the United States the leverage necessary to negotiate a peace from a position of strength. William Eaton led a motley crew of mercenaries. A lot of them were Greek and Eastern European. I think there were even some Turkish members of the mercenary crew that went with him. It's 500 guys, and they marched from Alexandria in Egypt to Derna. So across 500 miles of desert, where they captured the city of Derna and raised the American flag, which is the first time the American flag was raised in a foreign location, from what I understand. And they provided, through this action, the famous line in the Marine Corps hymn about the shores of Tripoli. That's where that comes from. If you know the Marine Corps hymn, you know that line. That big victory is what allowed the United States to negotiate from a position of strength. The Pasha of Tripoli, who was the leader of that state in North Africa at the time, signed a treaty ending the war on June 10th of 1805. So it went on for about 4 years. And he agreed to surrender to the United States all Americans under his control. It was about 300 guys, I guess, at the time, in exchange for $60,000, which was ransom and totally not tribute, because the United States didn't do that. Stretching back to the beginnings of the quasi-war with France, there was this expression that went around in America, millions for defense, but not $1 for tribute. And that was to demonstrate that the United States was not going to bend for anyone, and we weren't going to cower before the great powers of Europe. So this was kind of an effort to show that we weren't going to cower before anyone, certainly not a bunch of puny little Barbary North African states that barely had a government that was under their control, and that the United States would consistently stand up for itself. The treaty that we signed with Tripoli also contained an implicit agreement that the state would not send its pirates after American shipping again, although this was not honored for more than a couple of years, and didn't extend to the other Barbary states either. And there is a second Barbary War that happens during the Madison administration that I will get to eventually when I get there. Americans felt good and confident, though, after the conflict was over. They felt that they had defended their sovereignty and had demonstrated that their naval and marine forces could be deployed great distances away with success. I think pretty justifiably. Jefferson wanted to prove that though a Republican nation like the United States was always going to strive for peace, it would not sit idly by and be abused or taken advantage of without pushing back forcefully. A big piece of Jefferson's motivation for this, I should say, intervening against the Barbary States, was to send a message not to the Barbary States, but to Great Britain, that the United States would not suffer humiliations and bullying at the hands of a foreign power, no matter who it was, just because it was averse to war in general and did not take a belligerent posture on a lot of confrontations. Jefferson, I've talked about a lot, thought that warfare was generally bad for common people. He wanted to steer away from it as much as he possibly could, and he had this sort of kernel of an idea in his head that trade would eventually make warfare obsolete, that nations would be able to cooperate with one another on trade, and that this would bring especially other republics closer together. I've said I thought that was a little idealistic. I still think it was, but this was something Jefferson believed in on the one hand, while at the same time understanding that he didn't just want to send this message that the United States was a soft, wussy country that wasn't going to stand up for itself. So Going after the Barbary Pirates, you could kind of interpret, I think, as we're likely going to win this conflict. The Barbary Pirates, are no match for us, and we can send a message not just to these pirates who are messing with our sailors and with our shipping, but to the great powers of Europe, in Jefferson's view, especially England, Britain, because he still saw them as a big threat, that the United States, though peaceful generally, will stand up for itself. Much more impactful for the United States and for Jefferson in particular than this conflict with the Barbary Pirates, though, was the Louisiana Purchase, which was, according to pretty much every historian that I have read, the most significant thing that Thomas Jefferson did during his presidency. And I think that's pretty understandable when you look at how it changed the United States. It's not difficult to make that argument. So how did this happen is the first thing that I think is worth talking about. In October of 1800, after being pressured by Napoleon, Spain decided that it would cede the Louisiana Territory back to France in the secret treaty of San Ildefonso, I think is how that's pronounced. San Ildefonso. That's my best guess. This was partially due to France's dominance in Europe at the time, and partially a consideration by the Spanish that the French would be a much better option to frustrate potential American designs on Mexico and the rich silver mines that were so important. The Spanish government felt that they weren't really going to be in a position to stop the Americans for very long from invading Mexico and taking what they wanted, potentially. From France's point of view, the Louisiana Territory provided a dumping ground for undesirables, much as the 13 colonies had done for Britain. I discussed that a lot when I was talking about the colonial period in previous episodes, that Britain saw the British North American colonies, the 13 colonies, as a place to get rid of poor people, religious dissenters, any kind of troublemakers they didn't want, people in debtors' prisons. Georgia started out as a penal colony, for Christ's sake. So Louisiana to France was a similar kind of look from Napoleon's point of view. And it was the Louisiana Territory, a cheaper, easier way of providing basic necessities to the sugar-producing colonies of France, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and especially Saint-Domingue. And sugar was really important to France. It's almost difficult to overstate how important. It accounted for almost 20% of France's exports, and 70% of France's sugar came from Saint-Domingue. Also, Napoleon had vast designs on a worldwide empire that could not be achieved until the revolt in Saint-Domingue was put down. Now, from the United States' point of view, France regaining control of Louisiana was an existential threat. Even a Francophile like Jefferson, who you'll recall was about as sympathetic to France as any person who has ever been in American government, period, he assessed the situation in such terms as an existential threat, saying that the cession, quote, works most sorely on the United States, in that it, quote, completely reverses all the political relations of the United States and will form a new epoch on our political course. This is something that he wrote in 1802 to a fellow Republican when the rumors of France's acquisition were finally confirmed, because it was just a rumor for some time in the United States. These things, of course, as I've said in the past, take a while to travel across the Atlantic. The issue, why this was such an existential threat, was primarily the city and port of New Orleans, which, if you don't know this already, sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River. A very large percentage of American produce had to pass down the Mississippi River and out the Gulf of Mexico, and go to market on either the East Coast of the United States or the West Indies, or potentially all the way back to Europe. It was, New Orleans, a choke point for almost all American trade west of the Appalachians, and that is the part of the country that is expanding most rapidly at this point. People are going west like crazy, and Jefferson is very enthusiastic about encouraging them to do just that. According to Jefferson, quote, there is on the globe one single spot the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market, and from its fertility it will ere long yield more than half of our whole produce and contain more than half our inhabitants. He put it as starkly as anybody and saw the importance of New Orleans and saw that even if he respected France and wanted to have a close relationship with France, that anyone, any great power anyway, that possessed New Orleans was going to be a problem for the United States. This becomes a big priority once it becomes known that France has gotten hold of the Louisiana Territory from Spain. The situation was intolerable from Jefferson and the Republicans' point of view. Spain had been seen as an empire on the decline and not a real threat. But with France now controlling the area, Jefferson even talked of allying himself with Britain, of all places. That's like Captain America joining Hydra, for God's sake. The day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. That's a direct quote from Jefferson. He said that shit. And it's so unimaginable because you have heard, if you've been listening to me for a while now, how much Jefferson hated Great Britain. So the idea that Jefferson thought that this was a big enough threat to run to his mortal enemy, in his point of view, I think that illustrates just how important he and the Republicans saw possession of New Orleans. Fortunately for the United States, Napoleon's attempted takeover of the now sort of independent Republic of Haiti in 1801-02 was a total disaster, as he later admitted. By 1802, almost all of the 40,000 troops that he had sent to Saint-Domingue, Haiti, whatever you want to call it, had been killed or had died from yellow fever, including his brother-in-law, General Charles Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, because of course these guys have to have like 5 names. He was the one given command and he had died as well. This military catastrophe, along with Napoleon's telegraphing that he was going to attack Britain again, which American Minister to France Robert R. Livingston personally witnessed, gave Jefferson all the reasons he needed to attempt to purchase, quote, the island of New Orleans and the Floridas for as much as $6 million. He then dispatched his trusted friend and ally, James Monroe, to make that offer to the French. But even more fortunately for Jefferson, and for the Democratic Republican Party, and for everybody in America who was interested in expanding the country westward, Napoleon had decided he was done with the New World. And he offered France's entire Louisiana claim to Robert R. Livingston for $15 million, which Livingston accepted, at least on a preliminary basis, before James Monroe even arrived in France. Even with all this fantastic news, though, Jefferson had what he felt was a legal and personal conundrum. When Jefferson heard the news of the deal in July of 1803, it had been concluded in April. Again, things took a little while to get across the Atlantic. He was overjoyed, but also conflicted because he wasn't sure what he could do legally. He knew that this meant huge expansion for his Empire of Liberty and that it would be great for all the people that he wanted to help, but he didn't feel confident that he had the authority to undertake the purchase of Louisiana. Being a good, strict constructionist, Jefferson acknowledged that the Constitution did not grant the President or the Congress the authority to purchase additional tracts of land. He even wrote to advisors and friends that the Constitution would need to be amended, strictly speaking, for this purchase to take place. However, when word got back to Jefferson that the French were belatedly unhappy with the deal and were maybe possibly reconsidering, he hustled to get Congress to approve the funds so that the sale could be concluded. He even instructed his Republican cohorts in Congress to speed up the debate so that the chance would not pass them by to complete the deal. It was basically done by October of 1803, and it was a coup for the Jefferson administration and for the Republicans who wanted to see westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States, and at about 3 cents an acre, it's proven to be one of the best real estate purchases ever conducted anywhere. Naturally, there was Federalist criticism from those who pointed out that Jefferson had traded money, which we have too little, for land, which we have too much. But even many Federalists found it very difficult to criticize what Jefferson had done. And interestingly, and I just found this out as I was researching all this stuff, I didn't know this beforehand, Jefferson had already been setting up this exploration of the Western Territory beyond the Mississippi River for the United States. He was apparently intensely interested in the West. I read this quotation from, I think it was Cherno's Hamilton book, that as Hamilton looked east toward Europe for the future of the United States, Jefferson looked west. Jefferson was very, very interested in westward expansion, thought that was the future of the country. It certainly fits with this whole narrative of the United States being a nation of small farmers, yeoman farmers, right? That's where the land would come from. And in service of that vision, Jefferson had already been planning and setting up his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis's old army buddy, William Clark, for an expedition to check out the interior of North America and hopefully find a route to the Pacific Ocean. This was even before the Louisiana Purchase was even on the table. For example, Congress had approved funds of $2,500 in February of 1803. That's just after Monroe had been sent to Paris to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans from the French government. Lewis and Clark departed St. Louis on May 14th of 1804, again before Jefferson ever knew that the Louisiana Purchase was concluded. And with about 40 men, they were gone for a little over 2 years. They didn't return until September of 1806. Their, at times, harrowing journey yielded a vast wealth of information about the land, the flora and fauna, the plants and animals, the native peoples, and the routes they had gone up the Missouri River and across the Rockies, down the Columbia, into the Pacific Ocean. All of that stuff was mapped out, and their records were shared with people as they got back from their long voyage in the fall of 1806. One of the objectives of this expedition, from the Jefferson point of view, was to establish friendly relations with Native Americans in this part of what would eventually be the United States. They, Lewis and Clark, were instructed to establish friendly relations with as many Native American tribes as they could, and they passed out these special medals featuring Jefferson's likeness on the one side and this picture of two hands coming together as if to shake on the other. They did this as they met with various Native tribes and were greatly assisted along the way by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea and her, I think, French trapper husband, because that was a thing that was pretty common. The French fur trappers got out west a lot quicker than a lot of English-descended Americans did, and quite a few of them ended up taking on Native American wives, in many cases for business reasons, so they could communicate with the people that they were conducting this fur trade with. Both Sacagawea and her husband helped to communicate between Lewis and Clark on the one hand and all these native tribes on the other hand, because some of the native tribes already spoke French, or at least, one or two of their people did, and that was how they managed to communicate. Or Sacagawea would provide an Indian translation of whatever language they spoke, and she would translate that into French, and then the French version would be translated on into English so Lewis and Clark could wrap their heads around it. And so Lewis and Clark communicated with these folks, told them about American society, told them that the American government was peaceful and wonderful and was going to get along with them fantastically. Yikes. Sadly, and that's not the only sad piece of this, but sadly, Meriwether Lewis became involved in a variety of get-rich-quick schemes that never panned out. And it got so bad for him that he ended up actually committing suicide in 1809. And that was before a lot of what Lewis and Clark had accomplished on their expedition became very well known publicly to a lot of people. Clark tried to put together some sort of tome, some sort of record that would demonstrate all the things that they had done on this 2.5-year long voyage that they had completed. And Eventually, Clark was able to get together with Nicholas Biddle, a guy who was to be head of the Second Bank of the United States eventually, and he put together this narrative account of the journey Biddle did with Clark, and it became well known just how much Lewis and Clark had discovered as they were on this voyage. The things that they did, the knowledge that they uncovered, the things that they discovered, if you want to call it that, were passed along to a lot of Americans in the future decades. As I discussed in the last episode, the Native Americans really didn't figure much into the plans that Jefferson or the Republicans in Congress had. Most everyone who was involved with the Louisiana Purchase didn't think a whole lot about what was going to become of them. I don't think it's any mystery at this point that I have not the warmest feelings in the world for Thomas Jefferson, and this is one of the many reasons why. He very much deserves to be noted as one of the chief architects of Indian removal that culminated ultimately in the Trail of Tears tragedy, just a few years after Jefferson's death. Now, it happened after his death, but it would not have been possible without the things that he did as president. Not just the Louisiana Purchase, but the fact that Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, later administrations, followed Jefferson's lead in purchasing as much Native American land as they possibly could, and in expressing the sentiment of, we need to get our people out there, white people out there, Americans out there, and settle these lands as quickly as possible. That will ensure my empire of liberty that I want to see happen. And in that calculus, Native Americans played little to no role from Jefferson's point of view. So when Andrew Jackson would basically send the Native Americans on the Trail of Tears as he signed the Indian Removal Act into law in 1830, Trail of Tears didn't technically happen until a few years after that, but Jefferson got the ball rolling with Louisiana Purchase and with his land deals with Native Americans. Jackson really kind of sealed the deal with the Indian Removal Act, and the Trail of Tears actually took place, I think, in the early Van Buren administration. All of that is set into motion with the Louisiana Purchase and with what Jefferson did afterward. So he bears some serious responsibility for what happened to Native Americans, and it's one of the reasons I think that his legacy should be taken with a grain of salt. All that said, the Louisiana Purchase was very beneficial for the country in general, at least the white residents of the country, and for the future development of the United States, and it is probably Jefferson's most important accomplishment as president. So that's all for this episode. Thanks very much for watching and listening. As usual, again, please like and subscribe. Please spread the word if you would. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me at howthehelldowwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a text message or leave me a voicemail at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again, take care, and I will see you